So hello everyone. I want to briefly introduce Dr. Ravish Khosla. He has completed his PhD in Purdue, and he's previously served as a technical program manager at Amazon, and he's currently a senior TPM at Google. With that being said, yeah, take it away, Ravish.
Yeah, thanks, Dhruv, and great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So I have a few slides that I'll kind of go over for product management. They're intentionally very simple and just like kind of product management 101 type of topics, and hope to spend most of the time answering the questions. So I'll try to finish in 15-20 minutes or so. So before I begin, the disclaimer that I'm obviously speaking personally and not representing any of my employers. So here's a little bit of my background. Through a kind of went over it, and obviously you can Google and find my LinkedIn and my website as well. But a little bit of my education. So I did my undergraduate in India in IIT Kharagpur in electrical engineering. And I was kind of interested from that time more in communication and networking. It was more like wireless communication and optical communication. After that, I came to the US. I did my MS in Purdue University in wireless sensor networks. So they are basically, like these limited devices that are thrown, let's say, in some place where you do not have enough of internet. So, for example, it could be in a disaster recovery scenario like a fire or an earthquake, or it could be in remote areas like a forest or things like that. So I did some research in data dissemination protocols, and obviously, if you Google me, you will find my website, which has a link to my thesis for my master's and dissertation for my PhD. So you can feel free to read it if you're interested. In PhD, I continued at Purdue, did some research in wired networks. So that's basically in BGP, which is Border Gateway Protocols. If you have taken a networking course, they will talk about how the internet actually functions. So I was kind of very fascinated by that, on how complicated the actual internet is, and at the same time how interesting it is going back to our real life protocols, like how do we send a real physical mail across the US, let's say, versus how the internet was designed in the like 70s and 80s. So that was actually quite fascinating. And of course, along with that, there is tremendous amount of data. Even when I was doing my PhD, which was quite some years ago, we used to have like a huge amount of gigabytes of routing tables generated every few minutes. Now I'm sure it's increased by more than an order of magnitude. I haven't checked the latest numbers lately, but I think that lends itself to very interesting ML and data mining on all the networking data and trying to run some prediction algorithms. So I did that to predict availability of prefixes in the internet, and also trying to understand how resilient the internet is. So generally speaking, the fields I've worked in, so I kind of alluded to networking, also worked in cloud, and ML and data mining. After that, I started working in Ericsson. So I joined in as a tech lead, and over a period of a few years, I transitioned into more PM type roles. So I'll talk a little bit about what a PM does and a little bit of my experiences as well. So I think that was actually the like one of the interesting things where I wanted to go into both technology as well as business. So that was a very unique experience. After that, I worked in Amazon as a TPM, and then currently I am a TPM in Google Cloud. So a little bit about the product management basics, and then I'll kind of layer this with my own experiences as well, right? So I'm sure you have heard this many times, but PM is like the CEO of a product. So everything, so it's basically, if you launch your own startup, what would you actually do is basically what a PM does. So essentially, that is pretty much can be anything, right? Because as a CEO of a company, you have to do basically everything that uh, that starting from the vision, what do you want to build as a product, right? What do you and how is that important? to the company and to the market. What is your addressable market? How do you want to market that product? So that's a little bit of the what. There is the where, obviously, that's like the marketing part. So if you want to launch a product, who are your customers? And they could be, where could be both location, or it could be a certain segment of the market, right? Like how about if you are launching for a certain age group, right? That could be one. If you're launching for, let's say, teenagers, that's a particular age group. Or if you're launching for people, who love traveling, that's a particular function group. So like that actually is very important, because most of the times when you build a feature or when you start launching, you have to realize that so there is a concept of an MVP, which is a minimum viable product, which you may have heard. So that essentially is where the so what is the product that you will launch as the minimalist product that can still give you enough revenue and get your foot in the door? At the same time, it doesn't take so long to build that you're missing the launch window, which is basically you have to be either first at something or be good at something. So both of these are a function of time, right? You cannot just spend unlimited amount of time building and launching a product. A little bit of the how as well. So that comes to the execution. So execution, obviously, when you are building a product, like what is the technology stack that you're working with? Typically, depending upon, whether you're working in a small size company, like you have your own startup, or you're working in a bigger company, some of these things can be, discussed with the engineering team. So you could have, an engineering manager or a director, and they could have a team of, could be one or two people, or could be hundreds of people, depends upon how easy or complicated the product is. And that's a little bit of the how. And that actually does impact a lot from the product management perspective, because the kind of tech stacks you use or the kind of architecture decisions that you make, the PM should be very much in line with that. Because typically when you're building an MVP, you are building a certain limited product, right? And then as you extend, it should not lead to, let's say, a rewrite of the tech stack or a complete drastic change in the uh, you know like drastic change of language or something like that, right? So you have to be very careful on what you're building. And that is not just MVP versus the whole feature. It could be something very futuristic, right? So it could be something that the product, let's say, will start off by addressing people in a certain age group like teenagers, but eventually it will cater to every age group. So that will be a huge extension and a huge scale, because now you're really talking billions of people can potentially come online at any point in time. And then after that, there is the when. Obviously, like I was alluding to earlier, the when you actually launch a product is actually very important, because you have to be either first in a market or you have to be quite competitive, in which means you're doing something better versus your competitors. So that when and that those kind of trade-offs are actually part and parcel of your daily being, right? So pretty much every day you will have this constant discussion. We were planning to launch this feature and this at this velocity. Now either it's not going on track or we hit some snag. Now how do we actually change it while still maintaining the time? Or do we actually reduce the scope and keep the time? Or do we keep the original scope and maintain the origin and like basically extend the time, right? Because obviously with if you're falling behind, then if you want to maintain the original scope, you need now more time to build and launch. So I think the PMs, I don't know what's the percentage, but definitely more than half, if not arguably 80-90% of the PM's time is spent with stakeholders. So those are obviously, customers are the key ones, because anytime you're launching a product, customers, and actually understanding the customers, and many times also trying to predict what the customers need, right? So that could be one. So for example, arguably before the launch of social media, customers may or may not think social media is a good idea, right? So I've definitely lived those days when people used to think, oh, why would anybody want to ever join a social media and share their photos or share their videos? What's the real value in that, right? But so in that way, you could argue a PM, let's say a couple of decades ago or something, would not have even thought of it. And if they talk with customers, they would say, no, we'll never use such a product. But so many times it's also like trying to predict what the customers would actually need and trying to get into some of the things that they are not saying explicitly, but some of the things they may be using. So that actually leads to, let's say, you may want to have field trials. Let's say you're launching a new social media app. You want to like try it out with some of the customers in your target group, right? Whether it's an age or some of their interest area. And then, of course, a key set of stakeholders. So those are kind of like external stakeholders, right? Which, let's say you have a company that's outside your company. Um, the other set of stakeholders are obviously the internal, which is actually could be a lot depending upon how big or small a company you are actually working in. So it could be the dev team. So obviously, you're working with your developers, testers, technical writers, so on and so forth. And there are a lot of auxiliary functions depending upon what you're trying to launch, right? Like, so for example, security, you may have some security experts, you may have some legal if you're trying to launch something. Then what are the legal ramifications of launching it? Have you met all the laws in the place that you're trying to launch, let's say a particular country, a particular state? So there are really a lot of auxiliary functions, and many times, and of course there is marketing. So there are some people who are expert marketers. So how should they actually pitch your product to the target audience? Do you need some advertisements, or like what is that mechanism? Like, will it be, I don't know, advertisements on a website, on TV or newspapers or whatever, right? Like, what is that mechanism to reach your target audience? What do they actually use? So I think all of these are actually very deep discussions, and people, I think, so that's why like almost 80-90% of PM's time is spent talking with stakeholders. So I'll move a little bit to the PM roles in the industry. And this is actually, very like one of the most FAQs that any PM gets working in the industry. What are the differences between them and what is there? So generally speaking, they are pretty much very overlapping, and it actually depends upon the actual company you work in, right? So there's like obviously no hard and fast rule. There are people whose actual job titles may be even different than these three. It could be like a software engineer, or it could be a system architect or something like that, which was basically similar to what I had at Ericsson. But you may be actually doing more product management work. So definitely it does not mean that people whose job titles are not in these three are not doing PM work, but these are the three kind of most common job titles that you would see in the tech industry, right? So one is obviously the common product manager, and there is the associate version, which is typically the APM that you may have heard, the new grad APM roles that are opened by many tech companies. So that is something that is a pathway for people who are interested in the PM to join right out of a new grad. This is relatively a newer invention. As in, like, there used to be a time in product management where people were with substantial experience, and you would not see new grad product management. That obviously has changed as people have realized that the skills and the success should not just be limited to people with experience. There are people actually with who have either from their past background or internships, or it could be like if you have launched a startup, basically you are already a product manager, right? Or even if you have worked, not launched but worked part-time, because that is basically what a product management manager does anyway, like a CEO. So that was the APM role. Then there is a technical program manager, which is basically my job title. Essentially, that this one is basically thought to be more technical in nature. So this is typically a person with, let's say, a background. So I'm talking about the tech sector, obviously. So it is a background in a CS or a related degree. So that you are working very closely with the engineering. Many times this person could actually be coding. Obviously none of these positions require any coding typically in the industry, but you could have any of these people also coding. And then of course there is so that person, so that's why I said internal projects versus external projects, because it depends really what kind of projects you're working on. So internal projects, what do I mean by that? That are typically projects that whose customers are not like someone outside the company. So think of something like a Linux build system improvement, or some internal testing tool, or things like that. So typically, anytime you have such projects, the technical program manager is also the product manager, because the customers are basically other employees, your fellow employees in the same company. So in that way, typically you don't need like marketing or advertisements or things like that. You have a lot of those functions which do not exist if the customers are other employees in your same company. So those times the technical program manager may be 100% a product manager. In other projects, which are really external projects, like you're launching to some other companies, a technical program manager may work with an external product manager who's working with the actual customers, and then trying to funnel in requirements, discuss the roadmap, the launch plan, and so on and so forth. So essentially, it's a pretty, depending upon the exact project and the company, you may find yourself doing more or less product management. There are some TPMs who may not do much product management. They're mostly focused on the execution and implementation and the timelines. So there may be others who are doing a lot of product management. And then you may have heard program manager. They are typically a typical program manager will work mostly on timelines and less on technical aspects. That being said, it's this less is of course very subjective, right? So there are some program managers who may actually do more coding than a TPM at another company. But that being said, generally speaking, they're focused on mostly less product management, less technical skills. They're focused more on timelines and execution and working with all the teams and getting a product out the door. So more about the when aspect of it and less on all the other aspects. That being said, Microsoft is a special mention, as you may have. So for folks who have read like Cracking the PM Interview and similar books, you may have seen this reference. So Microsoft, because it was one of the first companies to, arguably invent this role. The program manager is actually a product manager. So there the role is actually, the job title is a little bit of a misnomer as compared to some of the other newer companies which are, have product manager as an explicit job title. So that's why I think these things are generally so overlapping in nature that it's kind of hard to split it out, and generally in the industry, of course. So the good thing to do is anytime you are interviewing or trying to target any of these roles in any of the company, just talk with someone in the company who holds the role. Recruiters obviously can also help, but obviously if you are reaching out to one of those people who are in these roles, they can specifically talk about their company and what actually the role does. So I will move on to the next slide, but happy to answer more questions if you have. So I put in a slide of transitioning into PM. This is actually a very big FAQ itself. All PM blogs, books cover this topic as well. But I also wanted to put this out there. So actually, there is like almost unlimited number of career paths to becoming a product manager. And arguably, almost everyone is doing some product management, right? So even when you are writing code, you are trying to figure out, hey, who are my customers? And a customer, if it is like some person who is in a different sector, different country, different industry, you would write it differently than something else. So obviously you want your code to be extensible. But for example, if your customers are mostly English speaking audiences, then you would not, you would still want your code to be extensible in other languages, but you would not focus on too many things about launching in foreign languages, right? So I think the common path, and which is basically the path which I took, is as well that you can join in any of the typically coding associated roles, like a software engineer or a reliability engineer, SRE, or a QA, which are like QA or a SDT, which is basically testers or quality assurance people. And then you can move on to becoming more product manager, like an explicit job title, either PM or TPM or any of those flavors, right? Typically, you may have seen many people in the industry have this common career path. So they started off with focusing on some part of more on engineering, then they got more interested in the business part. You start shadowing the PM or the TPM lead of the project. You start talking with customers, and informally you can be starting to do PM very, very, very quickly within a year or two. And then formally, of course, depends upon your organization and their policies, you may be actually transitioning your job title formally into the PM. There's also other set of, I didn't talk about this in the Ox but there are a lot of people who are front-end people, right? So they are doing like UI design, and they're also user experience. So which means like there will be doing research on let's say how a website should look, how transitions should look, how the when you click something, what happens as soon as you load a page, what changes, if you access a page from a particular location, particular country, whatever, how should it actually look, and doing those kind of research. Actually, these kind of people I've seen a lot going into PM because they are working so closely with the customers, right? So UI and UX, maybe not that much of UI UX for sure, but UI also, if once they are actually doing a demo or things like that, they work a lot with external customers. So those are actually very easy transitions into PMs as well, because they are doing the customer's part already. What they need to pick up on is the engineering part and what the technical stack looks like, and little bit of the all the code behind the front end, right? So they have to pick up on the back end essentially, and the other auxiliary functions. um, there are also another set of companies that typically take MBAs as PM. I have to say this has reduced over the years. There used to be a time when MBA was, I guess, much more stricter requirement than what it is right now. Um, uh, but that's another path. Typically, I have seen, although again it's not really required, and that's my last bullet there, question mark, right? But typically, I've seen these people who join PM in the tech industry have bachelor's in some CS related degree, so either CS or double E or something related to that, and then do an MBA, and then they pick up more on the business skills, and then they join directly as a product manager. This is another career path. But really, I mean, it doesn't have to be any of these three as well, right? I'm sure you can come up with other people from marketing, for example, that I haven't mentioned, will can also join in and then become a PM. So the good news is, like, I think PM is something which it's almost like defining cloud, right? Like even before the cloud or machine learning or data mining, these terms were really very popular. These things still existed, right? So we had arguably cloud in the 1990s when something like a Yahoo Mail was launched, or they were obviously in the cloud. So again, same, like product management has existed for a lot of decades. Maybe we have more formalized it in the recent past, and maybe put up explicit job titles. So almost everyone will have some flavor of PM in whatever role you're doing, and of course you can transition to that full time, and uh, if you enjoy doing it, pursue that career path, right? So something that I'll very briefly touch upon, and that will be basically the end, is one of the key things, as you have kind of figured out, is all of these are extremely cross-functional um, roles, right? So whether you are actually in any of the PM flavors, be it a PM program or product, or be it a technical program manager, you are actually working with a lot of people. Now, of course, depends upon the size of the company. If it's a startup, then maybe it's not. But in larger companies, it could be as much as 500, as many as 500 or 1,000 people that you are actually working with at any point in time. So this is extremely cross-functional. You have to be very open and willing in working with a lot of people, understanding various points of view from the customers to internal teams, trying to solve conflicts, trying to figure out the best way, doing some very hard trade-offs, which you do not know will be successful or not. So there's a lot of ambiguity. So this is actually, you will become better as you gain more experience. Just like people typically get better at launching startups, after they have launched a few, or even if they have done some class projects which may make a startup, right? So it's almost similar PM, because it's so similar to a startup world. You will become better in making decisions and get more predictive insights into what can happen and how each of your decisions can impact the future as you gain more experience into that. So with that, I'll stop here. That's kind of my talk. I see that I took longer than I had planned, but I'll go ahead with the questions.
Great. Thank you. I took a lot away from that, and I hope that other people also took away a lot of great insights from that. With that, I'd request everyone, if you're comfortable enough, just turn on your camera so that Ravish can see you as well, and then we can dive into our Q&A. Feel free to put your questions in the chat as well, or like unmute your mic and ask questions. But I think the first question is from Kyle from our thread of questions earlier. Kyle, if you want to ask that question.
Well, I looked at your LinkedIn. I saw you bounced around from, quite a few places. So I'm just wondering, how does Google's culture impact what you do? And like, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, each company has a unique culture, and Google obviously is, as you may have heard from other people, it's very nice and open culture, and it kind of fosters a lot of respect for each other. I think that's one of our culture main principles. So essentially, it really helps become being a PM in such a company, because one of the things you want actually is you want people to disagree with you as a PM, right? Because the last thing you want is you will launch a product which either no one uses, or it, basically your launch isn't successful in all the metrics that you're thinking, whether it's the number of users, the engagement ratio, the whatever, right? So I think in that way, uh, being in a company where you are can be you people have respect for each other, as well as like can openly disagree with you, is actually very useful. But yeah, I mean, I would say in general, it really depends upon the actual people, right? Like that you're working with. That being said, independent of whichever company you work with, ultimately you work with a subset of people, right? So obviously there is a company culture, but you may be working with, let's say, 500 or 1,000 people, which is a subset of the entire company. So it really depends upon who you interact with on a day-to-day basis, ultimately. And a lot of these are also skills at people management. So like you can work with really good people at not so good companies, or you can work with pretty average people in really good companies. So I think it depends upon your luck and how you can handle various kinds of people.
I can go next. So, going off of that question, how do you decide like what team you want to work on, or like more specifically, what technology you want to work on? Like when we're interns, we kind of just get assigned randomly to different teams, like cybersecurity or like the financial team and stuff like that. But I feel like when you work full time, you like go into a rabbit hole and you work on a specific technology, and then you don't switch that often. Like you can't go from cybersecurity to like consumer product like Twitter like randomly. So how would you just say like the best steps to figuring out what type of technology you actually want to work on?
Yeah, that's a good question. Also, very hard question, because ultimately it's very subjective, right? So, um, I also think that what you actually want to work on changes as you grow through your career, maybe get older, or just get more experience. So I think it's very hard. I think the best way is try a few projects. So let's say you're interning and you have a couple of interns, summers or the fall or a regular semester, and try a few different companies in a few different sectors. So you could try a real consumer company, you could try a social media company, you could try like a software or a PM job in the back end. So you can try a few different things to see what you like. I think it all, from the technology point of view. That being said, you are as an intern, sure, you are assigned, because in a summer it's not enough time to actually switch projects, right? You have to like ramp up and produce something. But typically, if you enter a big enough company which has a lot of choices, you can definitely switch even within the company. And depends upon like how big the company is and what all areas it works on. But you have a chance in any of the, like, for example, some of the big tech companies, you have a chance of doing something completely diverse, right? So you could like work on YouTube versus Google Cloud versus Gmail, are quite different products. um, and then of course there, each of them you can focus on the back end or more customer experience or tools or whatnot, right? So each of these, and that's true for a lot of the big tech companies. So you can pretty much choose a lot of these products and then kind of change and see how you like it. I think in general, there is also a set of, like, thinking from the PM angle, is what customers do you like working with, right? So there are some people who really like working with internal employees and internal tools, that they want to make the life of their coworkers better. Whereas there are other people who really like working with external customers, which by the way could be very challenging, right? So if you have checked any of the Amazon reviews or things like that, you would see people are usually very critical of products for all kinds of reasons, right? Like, you got a phone, I don't like the color of the phone, so this phone isn't good, right? So you could really come up with very critical customers who are disliking your product for something that is not even important for you, but from ultimately the customer is always right. Like they are the paying customer, right? So that's why working with external customers can be very interesting, but very challenging. So I think it really depends upon that customer segment as well, what you actually like. So hopefully that gave you some
Thanks. That
insights.
was a good answer.
I could go next. One question that I have is, how do you manage between like stakeholder requests when you're managing a product versus your own sort of goals for the product in terms of features and functionality?
Yeah, that's another very good question, and very difficult to give general answers. I think it really depends upon, you have to always have a vision for the product. And I would not say absolutely blindly stick to the vision, but at least, make sure you have convincing data to overturn your vision, right? Like, for example, you started to launch a product and you found another competitor has launched in the meantime while you were still building it. That's a good data point. Or you really got some other insights by doing some customer field trials that, hey, I really wanted to launch this social media app, and let's say 90% of my users in my target age group hate it. So you can, of course, you should be willing to change your mind. I wouldn't say you should be inflexible, but a lot of these things are, you should keep your vision of the product as the guiding light in general. And then of course comes the stakeholder request. So like I was alluding to earlier, many times customers may or may not know what they actually like, right? So if you're launching a product which has never been there in the industry before, it's kind of hard to ask the customers, what do you actually like? Because like before the advent of smartphones, people would be like, no, we would never want a phone without a keyboard, right? Like that's a very bad idea. But when the iPhone was launched, then people said, oh yeah, this looks like it could actually work, right? So that's why it's very hard. If you went to customers at that point and they would all request phones with better keyboards or better typing functionality and so on and so forth. So that's actually very interesting. So in that way, like, you have to kind of balance out your vision versus the stakeholder requests. That being said, you should not, so that's where the tough balancing act comes in as a PM, right? So all the time you're kind of debating. Some of the requests may sound very unimportant to you, like maybe the form factor or the screen size or something, like which maybe is not important. I'm just thinking of building a phone, but it could apply to any product. And then, but when the stakeholder request comes in, it may actually prioritize something that you never thought of at the top of the queue. So that is something that you should always keep an eye open for. I think the general idea is have a vision and be quite flexible in changing what you actually want. So that's, you have an MVP, but it does undergo some changes. But then you should also have a percentage. So one of the rule of thumb that I have is like, if you are changing more than, I mean, you can make that threshold, there is no strict limit, but if you're changing more than 30-40% of a product, you're pretty much building a new product, right? So so that kind of indicates that something was wrong. Either your vision wasn't that correct, or the customers changed, or some other factor in the market changed. So I think you should be, it's a tough balancing act, long story short, but you have to be very open and flexible and try to balance based upon various factors.
Thanks. And just like a quick follow-up to that, do
Sure.
you account for stakeholder requests like throughout the development process? Like, is there like a portion dedicated to that, or do you just accommodate them as they come in?
Yeah, that's a very good question as well. So there is this traditional debate of, let's say, let's take some simple numbers, right? So let's say you were building a product, you sat down with an engineer, or, you were an engineer yourself, and you swagged it out, depends, how big or small the company is. And then you said the product is going to take 100 man weeks. So you were like, sure, I will hire, like, I go to a director and say, hey, give me 20 of your developers, right? So this is a very small example. So, let's say in 5 weeks, we should be done mostly coding, and then some launch, let's say we should be done in 2 months, right? And then 3 weeks later, you get a new stakeholder feature request. Now, what do? Now, you obviously, I mean, it's not practical, neither is it really a good idea to keep engineering capacity. Like, you would not say one guy just sit idle, wait for a request to come in, right? That's not going to work out, obviously. So you're not really keeping at any point spare capacity for requests. That being said, so this is really the PM's tough job, right? And if you have read about like this Agile versus Waterfall implementation methods, right? So there the Agile basically keeps a certain sprint, right? So if in my example, if you kept like a 2-week sprint, it's basically, let's say 2.5 sprints, or let's say 3 sprints to execute the feature, right? So you can say that for a certain period, I will not accept change in requirements, because literally if the requirements change every day, it's not feasible. But you have to be willing to put new things in the queue. And that's why something like an Agile is really useful. So you can decide the frequency, is it 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever, depends on how big or small the project is. But you will put new things on the top, and then reprioritize it. So there is something, if you go into really the Agile development and so on, depends like what you follow. You can follow like Scrum or any other implementation, Kanban, or whatever other implementation of Agile. But if you go into that, there is something called a backlog grooming meeting, which we used to have very religiously in some jobs. So there, like, you are basically at any point, you have a set of user stories that you have ordered in priority order, right, with some scoring mechanism, or it could be a simple discussion between the team. So anytime new requests are come in, they are stack ranked against your backlog list. So the next time the team meets in the next sprint, they're going to pick up, let's say, the top 20 points of stories. It could be 2 stories, 3 stories, whatever. So in that way, you are kind of catering to stakeholder requests. At the same time, you are not like changing requirements on engineers every day, where they are like building code for something one day and completely changing the other day.
Got it. Thank you. That definitely answered my question.
Sure, no problem.
Hey, Ravish, first of all, thank you so much for being here. I had a quick question, and it's been something I've been wondering about recently. I was talking to someone who works at TikTok, and I found out even Facebook does the same thing, where if you want to work on your own product or your own feature, you just need to gather a certain number of engineers, and you can be the PM, and you can basically start. It's a very self-starter culture. Is Google similar in that respect? Like, how, if I want to work on my own product at Google, how, what is the process like? Is it common to just be able to get a team started and work on it with a couple of engineers, or how does the whole transition happen if you want to work on something of your own at a company?
Yeah, I mean, there are many ways, but one of the common ways people use at Google that I have seen is people have a 20% time, right? So you have anyway a 20% time of, working on something that you like, of course, somewhat related to your job. So that many of the times people do use 20% projects as a way to, so obviously if you are, and you obviously don't even have to be in a formal PM role, right? You can be a software engineer or really any title in the company, and you can say, hey, I want to be the PM of this 20% project. Now, obviously it's up to you then on how you're going to, make enough documentation to convince people to join your team, right? So that's another discussion. But like if as a PM, like you have to make a good business case, you have to say what is the value add. If let's say it's a 20% project in Google, you will say something like, what is the relation with the business and so on and so forth. And then of course, if you can convince enough people, you can definitely start a project on your own, right? There are of course many other techniques and at companies which do not have a specific percentage of time as well, but the people do take on a lot of new projects, and some of you may have read this already, like a lot of the coolest features in, or even products in the industry, are all someone's spare time projects, right? Because people do like to do a lot of things in the spare time. So in general, even if you're working in a company which is doesn't have a formal policy or anything, you can always, I've seen people do make their own project proposals, and then they get a few people working on it. I think a lot of people will definitely want to work in this spare time, but of course if it goes beyond a point, like you need like 100 people to work on that's like a significant financial investment for any company, right? So even if people are spending few hours a week, that's a big financial investment. So at that point you may need some ratification from a leadership of any company.
Yeah, I remember reading, I think Gmail was a 20% project, which became it was a side project, which became obviously a massive feature. Another question I had, a quick follow-up. So I'm starting a new engineering role, and it's my goal to transition into PM later on. I've startup experience. I've done my own startup thing before. But I'm wondering what kind of opportunity should I look out for right now? Or, like, I know having a customer facing role can be helpful, or like basically in my role as a software engineer, what should I be doing to prepare myself to be a suitable PM candidate in the next 2-3 years?
Yeah, so I would say one of the main things is the shortest answer is shadow the PM. Basically, go to all the meetings the PM goes to. It's not always feasible because you will be doing a lot of work. So it depends really how big or small the project is. But the more time you can spend with the PM and his or her meetings, I think that is basically the best advice. So essentially, you will be and anytime you're coding something, think of the customers, right? Like typically people do is, and depends again on the company, but many times people do is they go off a certain set of written requirements and they say, okay, these are the requirements for my product without actually understanding where they came from. Like if a requirement says, oh, I should be able to support 100 concurrent requests per second, something like that, right? It's not a huge scale product, but still something like that. And where did that actually come from? Is it like from the number of users? How do the users interact with the system? So if you actually try to go behind each requirement, you will actually learn a lot of things about the product and its customers anyway. And that is typically a product manager or a TPM or someone similar would have that insight. If and that plus shadowing the PM in various meetings like the requirement definition meeting, backlog grooming, you will definitely be there. Even if, let's say, sometimes when you join in as a new grad, you may have an engineering manager or someone like more technical lead or something who's there in those meetings. You should just volunteer to be in those meetings, right? And try to figure out how you can value add, like contribute ideas or support someone, or even take notes, whatever, right? Like basically figure out how you can contribute and be a part of the team. So as you start working with more people and be in more PM type meetings, you will see people will start relying on you, like, hey, I have to go meet this customer, it's really similar to this one, can you take my place, I'm so busy, right? So things like that. So it can start by something so informal and then it can grow into something like an actual job title change.
For sure. Thank you so much for taking out the time to answer, Ravish.
Sure, no problem. Any other questions?
So I have a question if no one else has one.
Sure.
So I wanted to know what your motivation was to transition to the PM role. I know that you talked about transitioning. So I wanted to know, so after you completed your PhD and after doing all the research, what was your motivation to transitioning to kind of like a more product role where you can like manage more people? Because of course, it can be a huge transitioning. So writing papers, like doing all of these in-depth researches into like networking and all of these different technical concepts, and then using all of that into like managing people. So I'm just curious to know how that transition was for you.
Yeah, that's a good question too. I get that a lot. So essentially, yeah, I mean, typically the I guess the PhD stereotype is like typically people either do research, obviously, become a professor or code a lot, right? Like, so that's the typical stereotype. Once I joined the industry, obviously I didn't have, much of an idea of if I want to go into PM or not, right? But as I started working on the actual products, and I'm sure you guys may have realized it, especially the people who have done any startups or any class project or anything like that, that technical part is only one part of the problem, right? Like, so you will see many times many startups being very successful whose ideas are not so great, right? And maybe even the technical implementation is not so great, but maybe the product is launched very nicely, it appeals to the customers a lot, it just is marketed very well, or or it really fixes some problem that some previous products did not have, right? And or had, I mean, basically solve some of the problems that previous products had in the market. So very soon you will realize that technical part is only one part of the puzzle, right? Like you could have the most amazing code stack and the feature which completely falls on its head and it's the most worst launched feature ever, and it's failures. So actually some of the greatest product failures may have actually the best tech stacks, we don't know, right? So that's why I wanted to actually explore the entire piece of the puzzle, right? Like what it actually takes to get the product out the door, being a successful product, get successful revenue out of it, which is typical in startups also. But I mean, startup founders think about this way more than people who are actually working in the industry, because they have to get revenue and make their startups afloat. But that actually is a very big part of the puzzle. It's arguable what's the proportion split, but I would say at least it's a 50-50. where 50 is technical and another 50 is the product management part of it, which is like launching the product, vision, roadmap, in execution, implementation, then adjusting to feedback from the market, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so I wanted to look at the full picture. As a PM or any of those roles, it actually gives you a chance to interact and see the entire thing, which I think is a very unique experience. So I would say, at least to everyone, try out some part of seeing the entire picture of anything you do in the industry or in your own startup, or whether you're joining your friend's startup or something. So if you actually see that, you may find some other field, like it could be marketing for that matter, like, or it doesn't have to be actually product management, that you are can become interested in. As a PM, you actually work with pretty much everyone that's out there. That's like a CEO, right? So you pretty much work with everyone, and then you can actually decide either you want to stay as a PM, or maybe you're more interested in one of the fields.
Okay, great. Got that. Thank you so much.
Sure, no problem.
I'd love to know if you noticed any big differences between working at Amazon versus working at Google.
I mean, in my experience, I think I think the products, I mean, both are big tech, so generally both are in similar, but in general there are a lot of like the product was so I was in basically lab 126, which is the devices group, whereas here I'm in cloud, so that's a pretty different product area. So the customers would be very different of a device versus they are real end customers, versus cloud, the more enterprises, as like any other cloud provider. So that was a very interesting difference from me, because anytime, like even before that in Ericsson, it was a different set of customers. So anytime you go from one set of customers to another, you will see a pretty big difference in what you're actually doing as a PM. So that was one. And in general, obviously, each company has a little bit of their unique culture, right? So you may have seen people at each of the companies, whether it big tech or small companies, having a little bit of the culture. So that's obviously a little bit different. So yeah, I mean, it depends upon a person, what he or she likes. But in general, I always feel that exploring different companies gives you a chance of exploring different cultures and see which one you like better and which set of people you work with. And even each of these companies is so big, right? So I could go to another part of Amazon or another part of Google, and it would be at least somewhat different, if not 100% different. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, how does your team, so at Google Cloud, how do you guys optimize for delivering like speed, like delivering features quickly versus scalability and future implementations of features and stuff? Like, how do you manage the trade-off between maintaining certain pieces of code and adding new features and also making it like a scalable, with a scalable architecture and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, in general, again, I cannot go into too many details, but in general, you as a PM, you have to think of both, right? Because the scalability is, I mean, it's not obviously just in cloud, any other, even if you're building Gmail, or even if you're building, let's say, Amazon.com, right? Or any other website or whatever, you have to, scalability these days has to be always part of the equation, right? So it's kind of, I think as a PM, your biggest success is, let's say, if the entire world starts using your feature, which obviously is very rare. But if that happens, you should definitely be prepared. At that point, you should not like sit down with your engineering team and try to re-architect your whole system, because suddenly billions of people want to start using your feature. So so I think scale is always very part of it. The thing is, sometimes you can, a general answer could be, you may have to optimize for a certain set of customers first. Like, so that's basically the MVP idea, right? So anytime you're launching a product, you may have to say, hey, we are targeting this particular set of customers. So let's say you're building a social media app. I'm only targeting, let's say, teenagers. So you can roughly predict how many teenagers are there in US or in the entire world, right? So you must have seen in PM interviews, there are all these back of the envelope calculation questions, right? So because you have to do this estimation all the time. So you can say how many users can there be? And then of course, just because you're targeting teenagers doesn't mean a 21-year-old cannot use it, right? So you have to basically add some plus minus factor, and then try to focus your implementation on really the MVP while keeping the architecture scalable to, let's say, as your app scales to like people in the 30s or 40s and the entire world and different languages, different countries. So I think it's a little bit of defining the MVP and then expanding. Also depends like where your product is in the life cycle, right? So as you know, you've worked on startups. So once you start in the very beginning, you're focusing very much on the MVP. That being said, once your product initial version is done, then you're focusing on how to expand, how to like go to various other customers. So at that point, maybe the expansion is more important, scale is more important than the actual addition of features. So it really depends which cycle your product is in. Is it the beginning one or is it towards the end?
Makes sense. Thank you.
Sure, no problem, Ayush.
I guess the last question could be, do you have any advice for just college students who are trying to break into product management? Any interviewing advice, resume advice, things to do in school, just anything you wish you would have known?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a again very good question. Again, so the interesting thing to note is because PM is such a fluid role at each company, and everything is so different. There is really like no right answer. So you will see people breaking into PM from virtually any background. So that being said, there are some things you can definitely do to increase your chances in trying to break into PM, right? So you can. So one is like even when you're doing any project, be it an internship or your class project or anything like that. Try to think of it as more of a PM, like think about what are the customers, who are the customers, and then of course I know not all projects give this flexibility, but if you have a chance of tweaking the scope, defining an MVP, implementing the MVP first, and then thinking about some of the other problems like Ayush was alluding to, maybe thinking about the speed first, and then thinking about some of the expanding to other scale uh, and so on and so forth. So you can like always inculcate these PM elements in your projects, right? And then of course like show it on your resume and your LinkedIn and talk about it in your interviews. So that something is very useful. Obviously, any other experience you have, like your own side projects, your own startups, it doesn't have to be anything like special startup which is like launched and is very successful, generates revenue or anything. It doesn't, of course if you have that, it's really good, but it doesn't really have to be that. It could be something like a simple class project that you and your friends used. Even if it has 50 users, there'll be 50 different people, you will still get a lot of insights. So I think anything that you can do on the side and then like show your PM insights is very useful. Another thing I've seen a lot of students do is there are a lot of these business kind of, I don't know, clubs or organizations that students join, and they are like consulting with various companies and so on and so forth. So that kind of gives you an insight. It may be more business and less technical, but it gives you a good insight into how the business is run, how marketing is done. So essentially things like basically I mean, you don't actually need an MBA, right? Like you can actually learn all the MBA things pretty much while pick up all the topics while you are in school, either by, getting these experiences, watching YouTube videos, whatever. Like there's so much information out there in the internet that you actually don't need a formal degree to pick up all those things. So I think these are some of the things. And then of course, if you get a PM intern, that's even better. But even if you don't get one, like one of the things that I definitely, like I was saying multiple times, is pretty much any path can lead to a PM. So even if you think that, your profile and you're not getting that many PM interviews or something, just don't lose hope and take some job in the industry that is most fitting with your profile at that moment, whether it's software engineer or UI or whatever you have done in the past. So I think then once you go in there, you can definitely talk with your team, your manager, other people in the organization, and take on more PM roles. A lot of these companies make internal changes very easy. So you can, of course, you cannot change very frequently, but after being in your role for a certain amount of time, you can actually go into another role. So I think, essentially, if you want to become a PM, you'll definitely find a path. That's the short answer.
Great. In the interest of time, we can wrap it up for this meeting. But thank you again for joining us this week, Ravish. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope everyone had a great time listening to you and like learning a lot.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for the invite and great to meet all of you guys. If you want to, add me on LinkedIn or something, let me know and I'm happy to answer more questions if any of you have. But yeah, thanks for your time as well. And yeah, take care and good luck with your education. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.